Okay, let's dive into this stack of sources focused on something absolutely critical in construction, but maybe often overlooked until there's a problem. Scaffold safety.
Yeah, it seems simple from the ground, right? Just metal, pipes, and planks.
Exactly. But these documents, they really reveal a surprising depth of detail, stuff that's essential for preventing, well, serious, often fatal accidents.
And what's immediately striking looking through these is just the sheer scale of who uses scaffolds.
Hmm.
We're talking millions of construction workers in the U.S. I mean, one source estimates 2.3 million.
Yeah.
Another says something like 65% of the entire industry relies on them regularly.
That's that's a massive number of people putting their trust in these things every single day.
It really is. And the stakes, well, they couldn't be higher. The numbers are pretty stark, you know?
Yeah, they really demand attention. We're looking at around, what, 4,500 injuries each year just from scaffold accidents in the U.S.?
That's the figure, yeah. And tragically, 80 or more deaths annually.
And I saw one report specifically highlighted 24 construction worker deaths in New York alone in 2022, just from scaffold incidents.
Mm-hmm. But here's the thing, the really critical insight that just threads through all these documents.
What's that?
The vast majority of these accidents are preventable.
Preventable.
Yeah, they aren't just, inevitable consequences of working up high. They typically stem from common avoidable issues.
Okay. So our goal today then is to navigate these sources with you. We want to kind of unpack the why behind these accidents.
Right. Pinpoint the specific, sometimes really small details that matter immensely.
And understand the regulations designed to protect workers and see how focusing on prevention is just absolutely key.
And everything we discuss, it's drawn only from the information in this material we have here.
Right. So let's start by maybe reinforcing just how high the stakes are when you're working above ground level.
Well, falls are already the leading cause of fatalities in construction generally. That's, widely known. And these sources identify falls specifically from scaffolds as a primary contributor to those overall fall statistics.
And the impact isn't just human, tragically, although that's obviously the most important part.
No, there's an economic cost too. One source points that scaffold accidents can hit employers with up to $90 million a year.
Just in lost workdays.
Just in lost workdays. That gets expensive fast.
Wow. So while scaffolds offer, much needed stability and space compared to maybe a ladder,
Right, they do.
that stability is entirely conditional.
Completely. These sources make it crystal clear that scaffolds introduce significant dangers if they aren't handled with, well, extreme care at every single step.
Okay, so if they're used by millions, they're essential tools, but also really dangerous if not handled right. What are the most common reasons things go wrong? What did the sources identify as the sort of big picture problems?
Several key themes really jump out. A dominant one is definitely issues with improper assembly, construction, or maintenance.
So not just slapping parts together.
No, it's about precision. We're talking about things like not following the engineer's design, taking shortcuts, maybe missing crucial components, or inadequate stabilization, like not anchoring the scaffold properly to the building.
Or leaving off guardrails.
Exactly. Or not securing connections tightly, even
Yeah.
neglecting to use proper base plates. Sometimes they're called mud sills, especially on soft ground.
And I noticed the sources kept saying you can't just improvise. Right.
Absolutely not. Regulations, specifically from OSHA, that's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration,
Right, the one setting the standards.
they have really detailed specs for how scaffolds must be built. And using old, worn-out equipment, that's explicitly called out as a major no-no. Don't do it.
Okay. And tied closely to assembly, you mentioned inspection failures.
Yes, that's critical. These documents stress that scaffolds aren't a set-it-and-forget-it kind of deal.
Right.
They absolutely must be inspected regularly, specifically before each work shift. Each shift. And again, after any event, like, say, severe weather, that could potentially compromise its structure.
And this isn't just any worker doing the check.
No, that's key. It has to be done by a designated competent person.
Okay, hold on. You've mentioned competent person a couple of times now. The sources say they're responsible for inspections and overseeing assembly. What exactly makes someone a competent person here?
That's a good question. The sources don't give, a single dictionary definition, but they describe the role. It's someone who's capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in the surroundings or working conditions, which are unsanitary, hazardous, or dangerous to employees. And this is important, who has authorization to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate them.
So knowledge plus authority.
Exactly. They're qualified by knowledge, training, or experience to spot the dangers, and they have the power to fix them right away. Failing to have that qualified person doing the inspections is cited as a huge contributing factor to accidents.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess not having that kind of knowledge or someone with it overseeing things leads right into the next common issue you probably saw: inadequate training.
Precisely. Workers often just aren't properly trained on how to assemble safely, how to understand the scaffold's load capacity limits, how much weight it can actually hold,
Right.
or even how to correctly use the required safety gear like fall protection harnesses.
And didn't the sources say inadequate fall protection training is like a top violation?
Yeah, consistently listed as one of the top 10 OSHA violations cited every year. It's a persistent problem.
Which leads right into, well, insufficient safety measures or equipment being used at all.
That includes missing or inadequate guardrails, workers maybe not having or just not using proper fall protection systems.
Or even basic things.
Yeah, basic personal protective equipment, PPE, like hard hats, non-slip footwear, all that stuff matters.
Okay, what else? Overloading.
Overloading is another critical and often catastrophic error. Exceeding the scaffold's design weight capacity is explicitly mentioned in these sources as a major cause of failure.
And they gave that example from Austin, right?
Yeah, the Austin residential collapse, it's particularly telling. It happened because they simply miscalculated the weight of the materials, concrete, I think, being poured onto the scaffold, led to complete structural failure.
Just a calculation error. Wow.
Environmental factors also get highlighted. Seems obvious, but strong winds can be a huge problem for stability.
Sure.
Heavy rain can make planks slippery. It can affect the ground supporting those base plates.
Right, make it muddy or unstable.
Exactly. And even intense heat, can make metal components dangerously hot to handle. So planning for weather, knowing when conditions are just too hazardous to work, that's essential.
Okay. And one more big category.
Falling objects. Something maybe people don't think about as much with scaffolds, but it's crucial.
Like tools or debris.
Yeah, tools, materials, bits of debris dropped from a scaffold can cause severe or even fatal injuries to anyone working or walking below. The sources state that protection against this, like using toe boards or netting, maybe covering scaffolds, is necessary.
Okay, so those are the big picture failure points. Improper assembly, lack of inspection, poor training, missing safety gear, overloading, weather, falling objects.
Pretty much covers the major categories, yeah.
But where it gets really compelling, I thought, was diving into the specifics. It's not just the big pieces. It's the tiny details that can make or break safety.
Absolutely. One source in particular goes into really surprising detail about the importance of the scaffold's connecting pieces. The pins, the clamps, the couplers.
The little bits holding it all together.
Exactly. They're kind of the unsung heroes, but if they aren't right, the whole structure is compromised.
Like, what kind of specific issues did they highlight? What should someone actually be looking for?
Well, they list some very precise points to check. For example, spring locks on connecting pins might not be fully seated. Maybe the spring is weak or it's just misaligned.
Oh, yeah?
Toggle pins, the ones that use gravity retainers, they might get stuck open by rust or just dirt.
So they don't lock properly.
Right. Or something as simple as a pigtail pin, one of those bent wire ones installed upside down, makes it really easy to accidentally knock it out.
Huh.
Span pins can have their wire retainers detached, which lets the pin just slide out. Swivel chips on clamps can get stuck, preventing proper alignment when you tighten them.
Wow, so it really is down to the function of a tiny spring or just the direction a pin is facing.
It can be. Or missing or loose nuts on tube clamps, meaning the connection just isn't secure. Even the pins on adjustable scaffold boards, like the ones that set the height, they might not seat correctly if they're misaligned, or maybe the pin itself is bent, or the spring inside is weak. The source really emphasizes inspecting these, seemingly minor components very carefully.
And I saw where it's specifically warned against using, like, makeshift connectors, things that aren't the original parts.
Oh, absolutely. Things like bent nails, bits of welding rod, or just wrapping tie wire around connections.
People actually do that.
Apparently so. And the source is clear. Using those instead of the proper designed parts significantly increases the risk of failure, catastrophic failure, potentially.
So even though the competent person does the main inspection before the shift, that source suggests every single worker should kind of keep an eye out for these small details and report anything that looks off.
Precisely. Safety is a shared responsibility, right?
Right.
Being vigilant about the small parts can prevent a really big accident. Everyone's eyes are valuable.
Okay. Now let's shift gears slightly to fall protection. The sources spend a good amount of time on the specific OSHA rules for keeping people from, well, falling off. What's the core requirement there?
The general rule is pretty clear. If you're working more than 10 feet above a lower level, you must have fall protection.
10 feet. Not very high, really.
No, it's not. And that fall protection usually means either guardrails or a personal fall arrest system.
Like a harness and lifeline.
Exactly. A harness, lanyard, lifeline, anchorage point, the whole system.
And does that rule apply differently depending on the type of scaffold?
Yes, it gets more specific. For instance, suspension scaffolds,
Yeah.
the kind that hang from buildings, often used by window washers.
Sure.
They require both. You need guardrails and a personal fall arrest system. Other types, like maybe a ladder jack scaffold, might only require the personal fall arrest system depending on the setup.
Okay. What about the specifics for guardrails themselves? How tall do they need to be? Where do they go?
So guardrails must be installed along all open sides and ends of the scaffold platform. The top rail needs to be between 38 and 45 inches above the work platform.
Okay, specific height range.
Yes, and there must be a mid-rail positioned about midway between that top rail and the platform itself.
Got it. And I saw something about cross bracing, sometimes counting as a guardrail. Is that right?
Correct, but only under very specific conditions. If the X of the cross bracing intersects at a height that's between 20 and 30 inches above the platform, and the points where the braces connect at the ends are no more than 48 inches apart horizontally,
Okay.
then it can sometimes substitute for a mid-rail, but you still need a proper top rail meeting those height requirements.
It's pretty technical.
Yeah.
What about the side where you're actually doing the work, like right up against a wall? Do you always need a guardrail there?
Not necessarily. The sources mention exceptions based on how close you are to the work surface.
Okay.
For most types of work, if the front edge of the platform is no more than 14 inches away from the face of the work, like the wall you're working on, you don't need a guardrail system on that side.
14 inches.
14 inches. For specific tasks like plastering and laving, that distance is extended slightly to 18 inches.
But if you're further away than that.
Then you need fall protection on that side too, yes. Either a guardrail or a personal fall arrest system.
That level of detail is incredible. It really shows how much thought goes into these regulations. What about lifelines? How do those work with scaffolds?
Lifelines are obviously a crucial part of that personal fall arrest system. The sources differentiate between vertical lifelines and horizontal ones, and they have really specific rules for attaching them.
Okay.
For vertical lifelines, the ones that go straight up and down, they must be secured to a fixed anchorage point that is completely independent of the scaffold structure itself.
Totally separate.
Totally separate. You absolutely cannot attach them to things like standpipes, vents, other piping, electrical conduit, or even scaffold components like outriggers or counterweights.
Wow.
And critically, the vertical lifeline and the scaffold's own suspension ropes, if it has them, should not be attached to each other or even share the same anchorage point. Keep them separate.
So the system designed to catch you if you fall has to be totally independent of the structure you might be falling from. Makes sense.
It does. Horizontal lifelines have slightly different rules. They generally must be secured to two or more structural members of the scaffold itself.
Okay, attached to the scaffold in that case.
Yes, but to the main structural parts. On some types of scaffolds, they can be looped around both the suspension ropes and any independent suspension lines, but only above the hoist or brake mechanism. The key point here is they should not be attached only to the suspension ropes.
Fascinating how specific these requirements are for critical safety systems. And, these sources also included some real-world examples that really hammer home why all these details matter so much.
Yeah, learning from past tragedies is, unfortunately, a powerful way to understand the consequences of overlooking these rules.
Like the Dallas high-rise collapse mentioned.
Right. That was described as a complex failure, but key factors cited were things like inadequate bracing, wind playing a big role, and missing structural components. Basically, a convergence of several of the common issues we've already talked about.
And the Austin residential collapse we mentioned earlier, that seemed more straightforward.
Yeah, that was presented as a really stark, direct consequence of simple overloading, just an incorrect weight calculation during a concrete pour. Boom.
And there was another case study involving a mobile scaffold. That one seemed almost mundane until it went wrong.
It did. A worker was on a relatively small mobile scaffold, maybe 5 feet by 3 feet, working on a ceiling. Pretty common scenario.
But
But the scaffold casters, the wheels weren't locked or secured, and there was an open hole in the floor nearby covered only by a loose piece of plywood, not secured, not marked.
Okay, I see where this is going. And the worker was trying to move the scaffold while still standing on it.
Exactly. Which you're generally not supposed to do, especially if the surface isn't perfect. He apparently pushed off a wall to slide the scaffold over a bit.
Right.
As he did, one of the unsecured wheels snagged on something, maybe the edge of the plywood, and it pushed that unsecured cover right off the hole. The wheel went into the hole. The scaffold tipped violently. He tried to jump clear, but ended up falling hard onto the concrete floor below. Suffered serious injuries, broken ribs, neck sprain, a collapsed lung.
Wow. From just trying to move a small scaffold a little bit.
And that one seemingly simple accident, it highlights multiple critical failures all at once, doesn't it?
Yeah, an improperly covered hole, unsecured casters on the mobile scaffold, and attempting to move it while standing on it, especially on a surface that clearly wasn't clear and level.
And the recommended preventions drawn from that specific case study, they directly echo the broader safety advice scattered throughout all these sources.
Like what?
Like, plan safety ahead of time, ensure any openings or holes on the work surface are properly covered and secured and clearly marked, maybe paint wholly on the cover.
Right.
And use mobile scaffolds correctly. That means locking the casters whenever the scaffold is in use, whenever someone's on it, and ideally, get off the scaffold to move it.
But if you must move it with a worker on board,
then the surface has to be clear, level, free of obstructions. And the force used to move it should be applied near the base, pushing or pulling slowly, not by, pushing off adjacent walls or structures like that worker did.
Okay. So bringing all of this together then, the common causes, these really specific technical details, the case studies, what does this tell us overall about preventing these accidents? What are the core takeaways for ensuring scaffold safety based on everything in these sources?
Well, the message is overwhelmingly about prevention and compliance. It's built on having a system of checks and balances in place.
Okay.
First and foremost, according to these documents, is comprehensive mandatory training for every worker who will assemble, dismantle, move, or just use scaffolds.
And what should that training cover?
It needs to cover identifying hazards, understanding proper assembly, and use procedures for the specific type of scaffold, how to conduct inspections, basic maintenance, load capacities, and what to do in an emergency. OSHA certifications are often recommended here.
And those inspections you mentioned earlier, the pre-shift ones.
Absolutely critical. The sources stress they must be rigorous and frequent before each shift, and also after any incident or weather event that could possibly compromise the structure.
And always by that qualified, competent person.
Always by the competent person. But, just as important, every worker needs to feel empowered and responsible for immediately reporting anything that looks unsafe or defective. See something, say something.
Makes sense. And adherence to the standards.
Strict adherence to OSHA standards isn't optional, it's the law. That means following the rules precisely for scaffold design, construction, and load capacity.
And they had specific numbers for capacity, didn't they?
They did. The sources specify scaffolds must be capable of supporting, without failure, at least 4 times the maximum intended load for the structure and its components.
4 times.
And for suspension ropes, it's even higher, 6 times the maximum intended load.
Wow, big safety factors built in.
Yes, but only if they're built and used correctly. Using the right materials, manufacturer-recommended components, that's vital. No makeshift parts, remember?
Right. No bent nails.
No bent nails. And always using the required fall protection, whether that's guardrails, fall arrest systems, or other necessary PPE. Making sure that equipment is readily accessible, fits properly, and is in good working condition.
And power lines.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge one. Maintaining required safe distances from power lines is absolutely non-negotiable. Minimum 10 feet away.
10 feet.
And you must treat all insulated lines as if they are energized, unless the utility company has verified they're not. Don't take chances.
Okay. What else on the prevention list?
Preparing for and pausing work when adverse weather, like high winds or heavy rain hits, that's critical. Properly covering and securing all openings or holes on the work platform, like we saw in that mobile scaffold case.
Right.
Ensuring mobile scaffolds are used strictly according to safety protocols, locking casters, applying force near the base if moving while occupied, and only on safe, level surfaces.
And not forgetting to protect workers below deck.
Exactly. Protect workers below from falling objects using tow boards, debris nets, or whatever is appropriate.
And the sources emphasized these aren't just suggestions.
Not at all. These aren't merely guidelines. OSHA standards, like the specific one mentioned, 1926 Subpart L, they're regulations. The sources make it clear that non-compliance can lead to severe penalties, hefty fines, and significant legal liability if something goes wrong.
So documenting everything is important too.
Very. Documenting all safety measures, training records, inspection logs isn't just paperwork. It demonstrates that these crucial steps were actually taken. It's part of the whole system.
Okay. So the core takeaway then from this whole deep dive seems to be that scaffold safety is anything but simple.
Far from it.
It's this complex system that demands really intense attention to detail, from the initial engineering and assembly using the right specific parts, right down to the smallest pins and clips. It requires consistent, thorough training for absolutely everyone involved, rigorous and frequent inspections by qualified individuals.
Right, that competent person.
And just strict adherence to all these established safety protocols like the OSHA standards.
Yeah.
It sounds like a layered defense system where every single component really matters.
That's a good way to put it. And ultimately, every rule, every procedure, every piece of required equipment, it exists for one fundamental reason.
Which is?
Because real lives are at stake. Preventable accidents like the ones described in these sources, they cost lives and cause serious, often life-altering injuries every single year. It's about protecting people.
So as we wrap up, maybe something for you, the listener, to think about. When you consider just keeping someone safe a few feet off the ground, let alone hundreds of feet up on a high-rise, think about all those layers of prevention we've just unpacked.
Yeah, the design, the assembly process, the function of one tiny pin, the specific training required, the constant inspections, the detailed rules for guardrails and lifelines, planning for weather, staying clear of power lines.
What does that intricate system of checks and balances really imply about the complexities of ensuring safety in any hazardous environment? And maybe what does it tell us about the responsibility that's shared between the employer who provides the equipment and training, the supervisor who oversees the work, and the individual worker who has to be vigilant, report problems, and actually use the safety measures correctly every single time?